people can use the Bible to say what they want it to say. And that's not what God intended. And that's why I say misinterpretation of scripture. And unfortunately, the false interpretations have laid the foundation for the church to become complicit with abusers in some cases. And what we need to do is rightly know how to interpret scriptures so that we can support victims and hold perpetrators to account.
Okay, welcome once again to the Eden Ideal podcast. We are continuing our conversation about, what we're calling the divide between man and woman. Are we unified? We've had previous conversations where we've really discussed the different issues and the reasons why we think some of these things are happening, and now we're kind of shifting gears to talk to people who actually know what they're talking about. So today we have a very special guest with us. We have Lorraine Anderson Reed. I almost got that wrong. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Lorraine. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm very good. You come extremely highly recommended. We had a discussion with Pastor Maslin Holness a few weeks back, and she was like, "Listen, this lady Lorraine, she'd be excellent for this. You need to get in touch with her. She knows what she's talking about." So yeah, I'm really glad. Thank you for taking the time out to come and talk to us about this. Before we go, I just wanted to know a little bit more about you. So let people know who you are. So can you kind of just tell us a little bit more about yourself? Who are you?
Yeah, who am I? That's the big question, right? I'm Lorraine. I'm a Christian. I'm a wife. I am passionately involved in the work of domestic abuse and sexual violence. I have a project that's out called the Never Project, which I'm sure you may ask me about in a second or in the future. But yeah, I've been a Christian for, well, I say all my life. I made a decision for myself when I was 15, and I'm just really passionate about the Word of God and spreading the gospel in different ways, right? And I consider this way, in terms of working in this sector, in this field, as my way of reaching other people for Christ.
So I saw on your website that you've been doing this for like 10 years.
Yeah.
So what exactly, can you tell me your journey getting into this very specific field? But we haven't actually said what we're talking about. When we're talking about the great divide between men and women, and one of the biggest, I think, symptoms of that divide is situations of sexual abuse, harassment, violence. What else but people not being able to get along is that? That's the when people resort to violence, I feel like that's just complete breakdown. So that's the field that you're in, right?
Yes, I have been in this field for over 10 years, and I kind of slipped into it accidentally, to be honest. So I remember being at university. I was studying psychology, and we were asked to stay behind because a charity wanted to have a conversation with us. And I thought, oh, okay, well, this is interesting. So I stayed behind, and the charity was, am I allowed to name names on here?
Of course, yeah.
The charity was Victim Support. So that might be a familiar charity to people. They support people who have been victims of a crime. Doesn't matter what crime that was, from theft to murder, attempted murder, robbery, whatever it is, they offer support. So they came to my university and they were asking for volunteers to be a part of the witness service. So the witness service operate in courts. So when people come to give evidence, they've got someone there to support them, because they recognize it can be a bit of a daunting time, scary time. We all have images of courtrooms from what we watch on TV. So there was a system where volunteers would be able to support someone. So I applied for that role because I thought it was really interesting. And at the time I was interested in forensic psychology. So I got the role, did my training. I worked at Southwestern Magistrates Court and Balham Youth Court. For all of you who are South Londoners, then you'll know what I'm talking about. And I remember meeting someone who was experiencing domestic abuse. She had recently left an abusive relationship, and she had come to court to give evidence. And at that point, I had no idea about what domestic abuse was. And I thought to myself, oh, it's just a relationship that's just gone a bit wrong, or just, not great. And I remember hearing her give her evidence in court, and I was just shocked, like completely flabbergasted by what I was hearing. And from that role as a volunteer, I went on to work more closely with victims and in the field of domestic abuse, so doing a lot of risk assessments. After victim support, I went to an organisation called Solace Women's Aid. That's another really big organisation when we're looking at domestic abuse and sexual violence. And it was there that I really saw the need for prevention work and education and training, especially with young people. So I did a lot of work in schools, colleges, universities, just talking to young people about these different issues. I could really go on. I hope it doesn't sound like I'm going through my CV at the moment,
This is great.
But...
This is great. Like, it's good to know that, you sound very qualified for this conversation, so it's good.
But yes, I absolutely loved working with young people and sharing the information, because that's where you need to get them, right? When they're young, you just need to give them the knowledge, the tools on how to navigate their relationships and what abusive relationships look like and what healthy relationships look like. So from there, I went to really, really challenging crisis work. So I worked at St. George's Hospital in the A&E department. And for anyone who knows St. George's, it's the biggest major trauma centre in London. So my role there was to support people who came into A&E as a result of domestic abuse or sexual violence or child sexual exploitation. So it was a lot of meeting those people there and then in the middle of the crisis, and trying to support them through it and give them the help that they needed. So that was a challenging role, but definitely loved it, because sometimes when you go to hospital, you can slip through the net. And if medical staff are not aware of the signs of domestic abuse, then, you will just get fixed up and then you go home, or go wherever you're going. So it was a really important role. And then I went on to be a MARAC coordinator. So MARAC stands for Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference. And it's where they discuss really high-risk cases of domestic abuse. And when I say high risk, I mean at risk of serious harm or possibly homicide, so being killed by your partner, ex-partner, or family member. So I did that. I see your eyebrows just raised, Tolu. I know it's a lot, right?
So, it is like it is like yeah.
If you're not familiar with this sector, you don't realize the amount of things that go on behind the scenes and how important it is. And now I currently, as well as doing the Never Project, I work with perpetrators of abuse. So I've literally gone on the other side now to do more prevention work. So whilst I love education and training, there's also that one-to-one prevention work that's needed with the people who are doing the abuse, perpetrating the abuse.
I'd really love to ask you some questions about that, because that's like, I think most people think about the victims, but you're going to like the actual kind of root of it. So I'm really keen to talk to you about some of that. So I think this is like really interesting. I want to ask, like, this might be like a difficult question to answer, but this is such a niche area. Would you say that you see this more as a job, a career, a vocation, or more as a calling? Where do you think you land?
That is, I think I see it as both. Can I see it as both?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think I see it as both because obviously it's my career, but even if I wasn't doing the role that I'm doing, say I went completely, a different route, say I went into media or something, I would still be doing this in churches and talking to churches and Christians, people of faith about this topic as well. So yeah, I don't think I would ever stop that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't see there's not many people that do it.
Yeah.
That makes sense. It's
Yeah.
hard to
Yeah.
find someone else that's doing the exact same thing. So yeah, when I heard about Eden Idea, I was just like, oh wow, at least you guys you're raising awareness and you're talking about these things. But yeah, that's not often the case.
I think is, I'll be completely honest with me, the of course everybody knows that these things happen and it's just out there, but I'd never been confronted by it, and I'd never been kind of forced to have a conversation about it. But we were having like a small group meeting, and it was around the time that lady, I think Sarah,
Everard.
Sarah Everard, who got attacked by a police officer, and like we kind of gave the floor to like the ladies in the group to kind of just share what their feelings are, what their thoughts are. And it was just, I was so shocked at how widespread it was, that like almost everyone had a story. Even my own wife, who I've heard a lot of stories from her, but like she was saying new things that I hadn't heard, and it was like, wow, like this thing is all over the place. And like the ladies in the group, like for them it's just, they've had to just like, okay, this is life now, like this is just how we deal with things. But like for me it was like, whoa, like this is huge, like what's going on? And like so that's kind of the thing that woke me up to it. So I think that's the reason why we're doing this, not because I've always known that this is important. It's just because I've just been like whoa, why aren't we talking about this? Why haven't I ever been prompted to have this conversation in any group, church, work, wherever?
Yes, totally. I hear what you're saying, because you won't know about it unless someone tells you about it, right? And I had the same feeling with regards to church. Like, how come I've not heard about this coming from the church when I was growing up in church? Now, I mean, I'm not that old. So when I was younger, I would hear sermons about relationships. As Christians, we're really good at talking about relationships and marriage, and how to prepare for marriage and whatnot. But there wasn't really anything that gave me the information about what is domestic abuse, what is sexual violence, what are the signs, how do you spot them, what do you do? There was nothing like that. And I remember in one of my roles, I went to a school, and I saw a presentation that was being delivered to a group of like year 9s, and it was talking about gender inequality and why women are abused and all sorts. And like almost the first slide was quoting something from the Bible, and how in the Bible, women are seen as the cause of all suffering, and it's therefore and because of that, we are undermined and all sorts. And I was just like, oh my gosh, as a Christian, I was sitting there thinking, is this the first slide that you are showing these young people? And I thought to myself, if that's the information they're getting from school, what are they getting from the actual church? A correct understanding and interpretation of scripture, not just an organization spin on it and then they're teaching it to the young people. So I was really passionate to say, no, this information has got to be shared with our young people in church. I want them to hear it here first. Yeah. And then when they go to school, okay, they can hear it there. But as a church, we should be educating our young people on this topic.
100%. Like it almost feels like, because I have some friends who are they're not in the church, but they're very active in like promoting equality and working in that field, and a lot of them see it as kind of almost the church that's kind of one of the biggest offenders in perpetrating messages, and I'm like, whoa, this doesn't compute with what I think Christ is and what I think.
Yeah.
So like, what is going on,
Yeah.
And then you see whenever something does happen in a church, it's just they buried, or like, push yourself away from it, all of those things. And it's like, there's something that we need to do differently. I think there are some churches that probably do really well. And actually, I have an interview with one of my friends who says her church has really like spent years really focusing on this thing. So I want to learn about that. But I really don't think mainstream general churches really focus or even understand that there is an issue to a degree.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you in that sense. I think that, and as you said, there are churches that are on it, like completely on it, and they, we should be looking towards, looking at them as examples and to see what they're doing and to learn from it. And then there are others that are just they close their eyes to it, and it's almost like if we don't talk about it, then it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And obviously we know it does. And I think sometimes there's a challenge with churches because, we're supposed to be loving and trusting and forgiving and all those wonderful things. But then when you have a perpetrator of abuse, how do you do that? How are you loving and caring and forgiving and everything? But, focusing still on protecting the victim, but holding the perpetrator to account. I think we have difficulty in doing that, especially holding the perpetrator to account. And we see it as though, well, no, we just leave it as though challenging abusive behavior is somehow unchristlike, or, it just doesn't. Well, I think we have trouble in doing that.
We're gonna go into the detail of this because there's a lot I want to talk to you about like that and how we deal with it in the church specifically. But before we go there, like you mentioned the Neva project earlier on. I feel like that's your main project right now in this regard. So can you talk to us about what the Neva project is, why you started it, like where it's at, what it's there for?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Neva project is
Never. I said Neva, didn't I?
And you said Neva. Lots of people say Neva, but yeah, it is Never. And it stands for No Excuse for Violence or Abuse. Never.
Oh, are you playing off Never?
Yeah,
Oh, I get it now.
You're getting it today.
My bad.
Yes.
I wasn't. I'm a bit slow.
It's okay.
Never. Okay, I like it. I like it.
So No Excuse for Violence or Abuse. And it's a training service that covers some major topics. So we've got domestic abuse, sexual violence, stalking and harassment, child sexual exploitation in the media, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, and honor-based violence. Now, those are some heavy topics, but the service has been designed to share this information so that everyone and anyone can understand. So it doesn't matter the age, that the sessions, the workshops are tailor-made and age-appropriate. And it's just to give people the understanding and awareness of these issues, especially if you may work with a cohort that may be vulnerable to abuse, if you're in a church setting, or maybe some people just want to know for personal reasons, or maybe they have friends or family. So it's just something that was created to allow people to get that information. And all those topics fall under an umbrella called Violence Against Women and Girls, or VAWG. That's what they call it in the sector. And even though it is under that umbrella, a lot of what we discuss and a lot of the abuse happens to men as well. So I do want to put that out there. We know it's not just a women's issue. Obviously female genital mutilation, that can only happen to women. But a lot of these things do happen to boys and men as well. But what the project does is look at, what is the difference here? There seems to be more women, more female victims than there are men. And we kind of discuss why that might be the case. And it's especially for churches. So there's also biblical references in these workshops. And we really go into it so that we make sure that our churches, our people of faith understand these topics, not only for people in the church, but also outside, because we're supposed to reach our community, right? And how are we going to do that if we're blind to one of the biggest issues out there? So that's what the Never Project is about. You can get a accreditation, you can get an award from AQA, just to show that you've completed the project. It can be done, you don't have to do all 8 topics, you can do 4, you can do 1, completely up to you and whatever your needs are.
That's great. Sounds great. Like, we're really going to try and push this out there, because it sounds like something that's heavily needed. But kind of taking a step back for a moment, this issue, because we kind of touched on it. Some people don't even recognize it. I didn't recognize it, like the gravitas of it, So how big an issue is this? How widespread is it, kind of from your experience? I won't lie, I read some stats online. Like, I saw a stat that, like, isn't it? I think I saw a stat on Google. 97% of women in the UK have experienced sexual harassment. Like, these are just unbelievably high numbers. Like, so I just want to talk to someone who works in the field. What do you think? Like, how big a problem is this?
It's a huge problem. And in terms of sexual violence, sexual harassment, when I talk about this, I'm always linking it with domestic abuse as well, because they often go hand in hand. When you have, and I'll tell you why. A lot of people think that sexual violence happens with strangers. You're walking down a dark alleyway and an assault happens, or, you don't know the person. When in fact, 90% of people who've experienced sexual violence, they know the person that did it. And a high percentage of that is when you're in a relationship. And people are surprised about that because of how we're conditioned to think about this. But most of the sexual violence and sexual assaults and harassment happen when you're in a relationship. So when we look at some of the statistics, I'm going to be talking about domestic abuse as well, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course.
That makes sense. So when it comes to sexual violence, we've got approximately 85,000 women and 12,000 men, which people are surprised about, who experience rape or attempted rape or sexual assault by penetration in England and Wales every year. That's a lot. So that's about almost 11 of the most serious offences every hour. So when we say serious offences, we look at the Sexual Offences Act 2003. There's over 50 different offences in that act. But we usually talk about things like rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment. We don't talk about the others because there's so many, but we'll just keep it basic. But approximately 11 of those per hour is a staggering figure. Yeah.
Wow.
So it's definitely something that's happening a lot. It's highly underreported, as you can imagine. And when we look at things like domestic abuse, so maybe I should actually give a brief definition of what domestic abuse actually is. that might help. So when we talk about domestic abuse, we're saying that it's any incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive or threatening behaviour or violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over who are or have been intimate partners or family members. And that's really key. Ex-partners. It's really important to remember that ex-partners can be abusive as well. It's not just if you're together. If you've separated and there's abuse going on, it's still classed as domestic abuse. And this is regardless of gender or sexuality. Now, this domestic abuse encompasses so many things. You've got physical abuse, sexual abuse, like what we're talking about. You've got psychological, you've got emotional, you've got financial, you've got spiritual. Right? If you're a person of faith, you've got cyber, digital. So it's so many things. And when we look at domestic abuse, in terms of the number of people, if we look at 2020, 1.6 million women and 757,000 men experienced domestic abuse. and these figures are pretty much the same each year. So you can just see just from those few statistics that it's a huge problem.
Is that in the
And
UK alone?
this is the UK. Yeah,
Wow.
the UK alone. And then we can take it even further and we break it down. We look at how many people are killed as a result of abusive relationships. So 2 women a week on average are killed at the hands of their partner or ex-partner. When you look at it like that, you're thinking, wow, actually, we're talking about murder here by someone who's supposed to love you, or who says they love you, and they're being killed by these people. 1 in 4 women will experience domestic abuse in their lifetime. 1 in 6 men will experience domestic abuse in their lifetime. And bear in mind when I say that, because remember I said domestic abuse and sexual violence often go hand in hand. So yeah, it's a really big problem.
It certainly sounds like I don't know. It feels like something that maybe people just don't talk about it. Obviously, understandably why, but if it sounds so widespread, yet it's just not talked about as often. And that's kind of something we're hopefully going to touch on here. Can I kind of ask a question, because through this conversation, we're very clear that like we're on a journey through this project that we're doing. We're on a journey just to understand things, and I've been like reading different things from different sides, trying to hear different people's opinions, guys and girls. And in all the statistics you've talked about now, usually the violence against women or abuse against women is much higher than against men. So, but there are people who say that the instances of actual abuse are probably closer to the same. It's just that with men, obviously there's a stronger chance of damage, which is very, very like valid to take that more seriously. But do you think that there is it's men that are really the perpetrators, or do you think that like just human beings this is a human being problem where we're just broken and we abuse each other? But it's just that with a man, rightly so, he has more of an opportunity to damage this person or create lasting impact, and hence we should rightly so kind of target that first. So I'm not trying to kind of create some equivalence there or anything like that, but I'm just saying, like, how much do you see this as a man problem versus a human problem?
Yeah, I see it definitely as a human problem. And that's not to say that, that's not to ignore the fact that the statistics are overwhelmingly high for women being victims. But if we're gonna really talk about this, this is a sin problem, right? Everyone has the capacity to be abusive. That's just fact. Everyone has that capacity. So I don't want to come across as saying, like guys are just this weird, different kind of species that, no, everyone has that capacity. In terms of abusive relationships, yes, women are more likely to be seriously injured, seriously harmed, or killed by their partner or ex-partner or family member if it's a man, for sure. In terms of whether the stats are the same for sorry, could you repeat that in terms
like in terms of like actually maybe the word I think they use is aggression in a relationship, that women are actually potentially more aggressive in a relationship. It's just that when a woman is aggressive towards a man, more statistically more times there's less harm, like lasting harm. But when a man is aggressive, it causes more harm, and that's where the stats come from. But in terms of aggression in relationships, that women also kind of do the thing, so it shouldn't just be focused at men. It's a two-way thing.
Yeah, obviously women can be aggressive, and women can do things that can harm other men. I've seen cases where women have stabbed their partners before, so for sure. But when it comes to domestic abuse and looking at it as a whole, so not just physical, because sometimes we can get caught up on that. And that's why you will hear the term domestic abuse now and not just domestic violence. But the manipulation, the psychological abuse, the emotional abuse, the financial abuse, it's really high in terms of being perpetrated by men.
By men, yeah.
Yeah. And as I said before, this is a human problem. I don't want to make it sound like I'm male bashing, because that is definitely not what I'm about. But that's just facts. And yeah,
I think it's really important to acknowledge that.
Yeah, for
it's
sure.
really, because I wanted to ask that question so that we could be fair and objective. But if we're really going to target solutions, we also need to understand kind of where it's coming from and what the kind of things are.
Yeah.
So if the statistics back it up, then that's what we should be focusing on.
For sure. And then you will have cases though where, where how you record it or why it's happened makes a difference. So for example, you have something called violent resistance. So this is a situation where, say you have a female victim, a male perpetrator, and for years, this victim has been subjected to abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological, everything, to the point one day they rise up and they're like, enough is enough. And it's either I'm going to die or you're going to die, literally. And you will hear sometimes victims say things like this. It was either, him or me. And within that moment, it's a case of, right, that's like, I've had enough. Yeah. Like sometimes, back in the slavery days, and I'm sure it still happens now, where you just when you're oppressed so much, that's it, and you rise up and you respond in a violent way. Now, is it good to respond in a violent way? Obviously not. No one condones that. But when you do get violent resistance in a relationship, you have to be very worried, because if you have now two people being violent and the victim is no longer caring, like, you know what, boy, like, one of us is going to die. Yeah. When you have that situation, then you should be very worried. And when sometimes statistics may not catch that. So when I was a marriage coordinator, so on running that conference for high risk cases, I would often see referrals come through. Oh, this woman stabbed her husband, or this woman did this, and it's just like, okay, well, you don't want to make it seem as though you don't want to ignore the fact that the man could be the victim in this case, and he is. If you're a victim, if you've been assaulted, you're a victim, right? But we always try to look at who is the primary perpetrator and who's the primary victim. And usually when you dig into these cases, you realize that, okay, yeah, this may have been a one-off event where this victim, this female victim, has acted in this way. When you look at the history, there's just been abuse after abuse after abuse. And now this is the rising up of that person, where they're like, enough is enough. I don't know if you heard that case recently, and the name does slip my mind, but she murdered her husband. She was sent to prison, and then she was released early, because when they investigated what she was going through all those years throughout her marriage, they realized it was coercive control. And they released her early, basically, with the help of her sons as well, who agreed that their father was just, a monster. Yeah, so you have to look at these things, and please don't make it sound like I'm condoning murdering your partners, or victims being violent. But sometimes you have to look at those kinds of cases to understand as well what's happening.
I hear exactly what you're saying. I think it's kind of like, what's the root cause? So that's kind of like my next question from your experience talking to people, and that's why I was really interested to hear that you talk to the perpetrators themselves. What do you think are the root causes behind such behavior?
I'm glad you said root causes in terms of plural, because I think there are many factors involved, and often you might hear one single explanation for domestic abuse or sexual violence, and I don't think there can ever be one. And if we have this one-track mind to try and explain something, you're going to miss out on victims who don't necessarily fit that pattern, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So in terms of root causes, a few of them, gender inequality, for example. So that system of patriarchy where, men are considered superior to women, and have the right to rule them. And we know that gender equality exists. That there's a lot of inequalities in the world that exist. You know, if you have lighter skin tone, you're going to be treated differently, most likely, than if you have darker skin tone. If you're rich, you're going to be treated differently than if you were poor. So there's lots of inequalities. So to say that gender inequality doesn't exist, you know, that's a bit difficult. You've got gender stereotypes as well. So, you know, men are supposed to be strong and aggressive. Women are supposed to be passive, weak. So these sorts of things can really impact on how someone views another person. And, you know, I've worked with perpetrators who say there's been a fight between them and their partner. And maybe their partner has left a scratch on their face or their arm or whatever. You know, I've heard comments like, you know, I can't believe I let a woman do this to me. And that comment is loaded in itself, because what is that person's understanding of, well, you know, the value of women? You know, what do you mean, I can't believe I let a woman do this to me? So would it have been okay if it was just another guy? That's acceptable. But do you see what I mean? So what is the difference and what are we thinking in that sense? Media, Tolu, don't get me started on the media in terms of how we view women, how we view violence. I mean, how many times do we sit in movies and we watch violence like it's just normal, right? And when I think of movies, I think of examples like Gone with the Wind. I don't know if you've ever watched that. Have you watched it?
I have not watched it, no.
It's like, have you heard of it? Please tell me you've heard of it.
I've definitely heard of it.
Yes, good.
I've just not watched it. Yeah.
So it's like, it's one of those classics. It was made in the 1930s. And it's one of those films that come on every Christmas or New Year. So look out for it. It will come on. But there's a scene in that film where the husband and wife, they were arguing. They were upset about something. So there was tension in the household. And one day, the husband picks the wife up at the bottom of the stairs, picks her up, carries her up the stairs and says, "You denied me for far too long. You're not going to deny me tonight." You can imagine what that means, right?
That's in the movie.
That's in the movie, Tolly. But the thing is, that was in the 1930s and that was acceptable. That wasn't challenged. Nobody watched that and thought, what? Now they do. But that is a clear example of, you know, a potential rape taking place between a husband and a wife in that movie scene, but it was considered normal. Something a bit more modern, something about Mary. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, I've watched that one.
Yeah. Now, even though it's a comedy and everyone's just like, haha, it's funny, when you really unpick it, we're looking at some serious stalking going on there. And I know some people might think, well, you can't really do that with movies. And I'm not saying you shouldn't watch movies. I'm not saying that. But when you look at some of the underlying messages and how that might impact our views on what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable, you know, it's really important. The same with music, videos and lyrics. And this is across the board. We're not just looking at, you know, hip hop or drill music or whatever. I'm talking about pop and, you know, rock and roll from Elvis Presley or Tom Jones. All these different artists, some of the lyrics and what they contain in them can be influencing people, whether they know it or not.
So it's what we're saying. All of these things you've mentioned, they are kind of conditioning men to feel some kind of entitlement.
Yeah.
To be able to then go and do these things.
Absolutely. And it's not necessarily, I'm not saying that, you know, you watch a movie or you listen to a song, you're going to go and do something bad. But I think media plays a really important part in how we view women, how we treat them. Do we treat them as sexual objects? You know, we look at sexual objectification in the media. These things definitely going to affect us. I'm not even going to touch on pornography, but that's another topic in itself, really. So yeah, these all play a part. And then if we're looking at faith, you know, we've got the misinterpretation of scripture that can also have an impact on how men view women.
So can we talk about that? Can we talk about that specifically then? You know, what scriptures, what are the misinterpretations that you would see, or which scriptures do you think people have used in a harmful way?
Yeah, so I mean, the common one that everyone will probably quote is the one in Ephesians where it says, wives submit to your husbands. And we never really look at the whole chapter or other verses around that where it talks about men, husbands, love your wives. And when we look at submission, like submission is not something that you demand. Right? That's not something you demand. Submission is a gift of love. And I think even just looking at Christ and how he is with us, there's no demanding, there's no forcing. Like, if God doesn't force, then how are we supposed to be forcing other people? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
It goes contrary to the character of God, which is why domestic abuse, sexual violence is so heinous, because it misrepresents God in such a massive way. And when the church doesn't deal with it properly, it also further misrepresents who God is. And I think when it comes to the Bible, people can use it to justify like many things that they want to do. It's been used to justify the Crusades. Looking at some apocalyptic texts, people justify the Crusades. It's been used to justify slavery, preventing women to vote and all that kind of stuff. I think a few years ago, there was this American Secretary of State. I think his name was Jeff Sessions. And he was trying to use Romans chapter 13 as a way of condoning removing children from illegal immigrants. Really weird, but people can use the Bible to say what they want it to say. And that's not what God intended. And that's why I say misinterpretation of scripture. Unfortunately, the false interpretations have laid the foundation for the church to become complicit with abusers in some cases. And what we need to do is rightly know how to interpret scriptures so that we can support victims and hold perpetrators to account. And if you look throughout scripture, when we look at, for example, rape, every time it's mentioned or there's a story around it, it is a bad thing.
It's not a good thing.
It's not a good thing. There's nothing there's nothing in there that you might think, it's always, spoken about negatively. So that's just something to point out.
Like I say some things that my Bible study group get really when I say things like this, but like I think the Bible is at such pains to show that human beings are broken. Like even Abraham and what he did with Hagar, his Egyptian slave, that was not consensual. But the Bible isn't trying to paint it as a great thing. A lot of bad stuff came about as a result of that. Ishmael and his whole lineage came about as a result of that. That wasn't a good thing. No. But I think we want to kind of make all of these stories kind of airy-fairy and let's put all of these people on a high pedestal. But like I'm saying, we should still put them on a high pedestal, but because they eventually recognize that they're broken, and then they had to go to a higher power for sanctification and redemption. That's what we should be doing. I completely agree with you. It's just not consistent for me. No. Some of the things that I see, like people just cherry pick certain, even that Ephesians one that you talk about, wives submit. The very verse before it says submit to one another. So everyone's submitting to one another, and then it's talking about a very specific thing that you can't then say, okay, let's follow the second one and then ignore the first one, as if
exactly. And when you think about it, complete submission should be to God alone, right? Complete. Now I'm talking, there are some people who believe, it's like you have to, if you're a wife, you have to go through your husband then get to get. But actually, that woman has her own relationship direct to the Father. That is where complete submission is. And when you think about it, your project is the Eden ideal, right? Back in Eden, there was no need for this kind of instruction. Everything was as it was supposed to be. Perfect love, perfect harmony. Eve living for Adam, Adam living for Eve, them all living for God. So it's just like, this is what we need to get back to. It's not supposed to be this power imbalance dynamic where, one person is controlling the other. And that's just not the intention at all.
It baffles me because, like, if you actually look at Eden, there were two people working as one, right? And then it was after the fall, as part of the consequence of their sin.
Yes.
Then he says, he will hold his power over you, and your desire will be for him. That was part of the consequence. I've had people use that as the justification, and it's like, are you not reading the context? This thing is a bad consequence of something that they did wrong.
In other words, we should. Yes, go on. Let me not cut you. Go ahead.
No. Like, I'm just. That's it.
It's true.
How can that be? How can that be the thing that we're building our families
this
on?
is the standard. This is the standard. The consequence is the standard. No, actually, the standard is the Eden ideal.
Exactly.
It's before Eden.
The thing that was there before. So
exactly.
We're hoping, like, part of the things that we're hopefully going to kind of pull together, we're going to do like a mini series of videos talking about each of these verses and just helping people see, because the thing that really breaks my heart when we were talking to some of our friends was that they don't see the church as a safe space because of the things that people in the Christendom are saying. So, like, even though a lot of people in the church have a wonderful heart for people and they want to do the right thing, if you misinterpret these scriptures these ways, you inadvertently become, unfortunately, complicit in certain things if you do that. And I want to help people kind of see there might be a different way of looking at this, like I'm not God, so I don't want to say like I'm right on all of these things, but at least let's ask some questions about some of these scriptures and the way and are they consistent with the rest of the Bible?
And are they consistent with the character of God as well?
Exactly.
That's what you really want to think about. When I think of things like domestic abuse and sexual violence, there's a power dynamic going on. And when I think of Christ and when he was here, it was not power over. That wasn't the way he operated. It was power with, right? So when he went with his disciples, yes, he taught them, but it wasn't ever a case of, right, I have power, or even though he does have, all power, but the way he operated was very differently. You know what I mean? And I like to give the analogy, and maybe it's a bad one, but think of Donald Trump, right? He was very much power over. He's a power over kind of person. Like, my way is the right way, I am right, and that's it. Whereas Christ, that's not how he is. He's more power with, unifying, let's work together. Come, let us reason together, that kind of love, which is really important. And nobody totally can tell me that God condones violence in relationships or sexual violence or abuse. Like, no one can tell me that with a straight face anyway.
Yeah. So I kind of, one of the questions that I wanted to ask was, so when I talk about this, about the church, some people say to me, what do you want the church to do? This isn't happening here. Or, like, this is happening out there and we need to. So I just wanted to ask, from your experience, like, is this something that is happening inside, or is it mainly like outside and we should be a light and beacon for the outside? Or do you also see it happening, and to what degree do you see it happening on the inside?
It's definitely happening on the inside. And people say, oh, this is the church, it doesn't happen here, it happens out in the community. Well, the church is the community, right? If you're reaching people outside in your community, you're bringing people into fellowship and into a knowledge of and a relationship with Christ. So people make up your congregation. So it is definitely happening in church. I think there is a lot more research in America around this. A little in the UK, not so much. But there is definitely some, research to show that it is happening. I don't know if you're aware of Premier Christian magazine.
Yeah.
So they did a survey of church congregations, and I'm just trying to actually find that information. So they did something in 2013. I believe that there is more progress now on getting up-to-date information. But there was a survey of churchgoers, and they found 40% had been intimidated and 16% had been victims of physical violence. That's high for people who believe that it doesn't happen within church. You know, that's an example.
40%.
40%, 40. This was about 500 churchgoers that they did a survey on. So it's not a huge amount, but it's still something.
At least it's an indication, you know.
It's an indication, exactly. 40% had been intimidated and 16% had been victims of physical violence. And then 87% said that one of the reasons that domestic abuse occurred was because a partner needed to have authority and control over a relationship. That's what they said, which is very interesting and very telling. So it definitely does happen within church. I think the pandemic helped to shed more light on this, because obviously in 2020, everyone was in lockdown, which means that the victims were, you know, constantly with their abusers 24/7. It was on the news a lot. Before we didn't really hear about domestic abuse on the news. You know, you don't hear that every week 2 women are killed by their partner on average. You know, you don't hear that. You hear what they want you to hear. But during the pandemic, it was definitely brought to the forefront. And I think churches realized and recognized, wow, yeah, this is actually a problem inside and outside.
Wow. So I want to, so many things I want to ask you, and I know like time is going, so I'll try and be more concise. But so you mentioned there that, you know, one of the main things that people were talking about, one of the main causes was authority and control, that their partner wanted to have authority and control. So like that sounds very much like the traditional gender role that men are told to have. You know, you need to be the leader of your home. You need to control your home situation. So as a Christian woman, as a wife, you know, how do we walk this balance? What do you actually think about this? Like, you know, if you were giving someone a marriage course, what would you say? Would you encourage a man to be the strong leader of the home? Like, how would you actually navigate this without then leaving space for him to have that misconception?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what your view of marriage is, really. And I know that there are different views. And, you know, leadership doesn't mean violence or abuse. I'm not sure where we get the joining of the two. Leadership is not a bad thing. But, you know, there are those who they believe in what's called a complementary marriage. I don't know if you've heard of that before. But so this is where individuals, they consider themselves to be equal in a marriage, but they occupy different roles.
Yeah.
So there are people that have that view. No, we are equal. Yes, we're human beings under God. We're one, but we occupy different roles. That's fine. And those who believe that, they tend to be the ones who don't believe in women's ordination. For that very reason, you know, men and women have different roles. Then you have people who believe in an equilateral marriage. And this is where both parties in the marriage are completely equal in every aspect, including roles. So they're equal in all the roles that they perform. Now, whatever view of marriage you have, that's fine. But none of those views allow for abuse. And I think that's the main thing to recognize. Whether you believe we should occupy different roles, or whether you believe, you know, all the roles are equal and everyone should do them, none of them allow for violence or abuse in any way, shape, or form.
I like that. And that's a good point, because that's kind of like just breaking through the situation. Like, listen, regardless of what you think, this is still not an issue. This is still not something to argue against. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the roles, like, I know people who they're quite happy in the roles that they are. So I have friends who are wives and they like the whole, I'm going to clean the house, I'm going to cook the food, they're cool with that. And then they have the husbands going out working and whatever. There's no violence, there's no abuse, there's no, there's none of that. They just do the roles that they're in. I hate ironing. My husband loves ironing. He irons, right? So, like, do you know what I mean? As long as this is done in love, there's communication, there's agreement, I think that's what is a key thing here. And as I said, I don't believe headship or leadership has to equate to violence or abuse.
So what are the things that you do then tell people in your training? So now, like, to the meat of it. So if you were like, obviously don't give away all your trade secrets. But like, I mean, like, what are the types of things that you would then kind of say people should be thinking about, or ways to combat these misconceptions?
In terms of what I would say is, it's really hard to say it without giving you the training, but it is about education and understanding what abuse looks like, the different types, and how to recognize it and what to do if you see it happening. And that's within your own relationship, within the relationship of someone else. If you see it happening, what is the important thing to do? What is the right thing to do?
Yeah. So that is helping people in the community to be able to identify, or helping the individual themselves, and then giving them the tools for when if you find yourself in this situation, this is what you should do to get out of it. Okay. Exactly.
Okay. If you don't know about it, then you're not going to be able to spot that you're in it. And when, especially with young people, when I used to work in the A&E department, I saw so many young people come through and they didn't realize that they were in an abusive relationship. They just thought this is normal, or we fight a bit, and actually when you unpick it, it's not normal and it was abusive, but they just had no idea.
Yeah. And so, but this is at the point where something's going wrong. Is there something you would say to prevent people from even getting to a place where they start to abuse? Like you say, you work with a lot of perpetrators. What would you say is kind of like the number one thing that would prevent someone from becoming a perpetrator? Because I don't know what you think, but I don't necessarily kind of want to like say there's good people and bad people. I think everyone's capable of being abusive, and maybe certain circumstances or not checking yourself or misunderstanding it could then lead you down that path. So how do we help people not go down that road?
Yeah. Definitely tell them what it looks like. Just discuss, how do we handle conflict? How do you handle your emotions? What are your thoughts and your beliefs about your partner? And that's a key one, because a lot of people will say, oh yeah, I don't hold these views, or I don't believe it. But when you unpick it, when you dig deep, you realize that there's some messed up views underlying, in the surface, the underlying that surface to the top, and they don't realize where they come from. So in terms of working with perpetrators, unfortunately, most of the people that I work with already have a very long history of being abusive. And it's more about teaching them what domestic abuse is, what abusive behavior is, why they might do these things, how to prevent abusive incidents, and also really challenging them in terms of taking responsibility for their own behavior. Like, no one made them do this. And that's what you might hear a lot of. Oh, I lost control. Oh, I just saw red and I didn't know what I was doing. People know what they're doing. And when you question them even more and you dig deep, they realize, oh, okay, well, maybe I was more in control than I thought. So it's about holding them to account. A lot of people are in denial. that anything's happened. But yeah, it's just about making them aware, and discussing maybe where their ideas and opinions and belief systems come from. And I usually look at family and childhood as well, because the family, the home, is the biggest school that you'll ever have, right?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
where you learn the majority of, what you believe and how you function throughout life. Um, so yeah, there's lots to explore there. I feel
Yeah.
like maybe I've answered your question in a weird way.
No, you have answered it.
Not at all.
I feel like I need to come on this course. So what would you say to churches? Like, how does a church, like someone's listening to this now, like thinking, right, we haven't done enough. What can they do? Like, what should they be thinking of doing apart from giving Lorraine a call or put her details, and getting her to come down and give you training? But like, what are the broad kind of things? Like, is it about being visible? Like, is it about just talking about it more? What are the types of things that churches should be doing?
It sounds really simple, talk about it, but that is where you start, right? Talk about it from the pulpit. When the church is full, not in like a little Bible study where 2 or 5 people are there. Like, talk about it in front of your whole congregation, because this brings it to the forefront. This brings it to light. Abuse thrives in secrecy and darkness. So when it's brought to the light, then it's going to have to be addressed. And it's also a way to show perpetrators of abuse that, this is a church that obviously knows about what they're talking, and I can't get away with this here. Because unfortunately, churches can be a place that perpetrators flock to, because they know that churches are quite trusting. We're very loving and accepting. So this is a perfect environment to come and do whatever you need to do there. So if it's discussed, then that gives them a different impression. Simple things like putting posters on the wall. Where can you get help if you're experiencing domestic abuse, or you have done, or sexual violence? There's a list of organizations that you can give a call. Put them in the church foyer, put them in the women's toilets, in the men's toilets. These are simple but very effective things that you can do. You don't even have to have a training session to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Those are a couple of things.
No, that's really good. That's really helpful. So linked to that. So if we want to talk about these things, like I was speaking to one of my friends, and as part of one of the things that Eden Ideal wants to do, even on our event, is we want to create a safe space. Because we want people to be able to kind of talk about some of these things, but we recognize that some of this is traumatic and it's very difficult for people to talk about it in the first place. A lot of people don't want to share some of these experiences. So kind of a twofold question. How important is it that we find ways to create safe spaces so that these people have a voice, or we make people comfortable? And 2, how do you then do that?
Okay, so how do you create that space? That goes again to talking about it, bringing it to light, having people, maybe designated people in your church that kind of take on that responsibility or form that kind of support, maybe like a domestic abuse or sexual violence, not experts, but officers or volunteers or something along those lines. Champions, like where people know, like, oh, if I see that person over there, I know that I can go to her or him because they are one of the champions. So have that available. I'm going to ask you to say that first question again, because
I think it's all about it. So, like, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I'll add more to the question. Maybe I'll make the question a bit different. Something that people have, one thing we often do in the church when we're trying to have these conversations is we split up men and women, and because women find it more comfortable to have these conversations amongst other women. And in fact, indeed, you what I was hearing is you do have these conversations amongst yourselves, like it's out there. But like, I feel it's the men that need to hear a lot of these things.
Yeah.
And vice versa. I know the abuse happens the other way around, but on that specific front. So like, how do we, is it useful to have joint conversations with the men and the women on some of this stuff?
Absolutely. I think that is so needed to have a mixture. So we can have conversations, both men and women together. And then there is also space for men separately and women separately. Because sometimes there might be fear, especially from maybe a male group, of them openly sharing some of their thoughts and beliefs in front of everyone else. And I've had that when I used to work, when I used to do the sessions in schools, I used to do mixed groups and then just single sex groups. And I remember when I was working with all boys, they were very different in terms of what they allowed themselves to say when they were all together compared to when they were in a mixed group. And some of the things they said were very shocking, but I'd rather them say it and get it out there, and then we challenge, we talk about it, and we can have a discussion rather than keeping it to themselves or saying it to only a few who maybe share the same opinion. Because what you will find is you will have some men that will be like, yeah, I agree with that really disrespectful comment maybe or view, and then there'll be others that will stand up and say, well, actually no, this is not right because. And sometimes you need other men to be able to challenge other men, because sometimes I feel when it's just coming from women, some people just shut down, like, oh, here we go, another, oh, women's ministry is talking about abuse, here we go again, that kind of thing. But it is a lot, definitely more powerful when men can challenge each other.
Okay, that's really helpful. So just talking now specifically about kind of what we want to do as the Eden Ideal, I just want to test kind of the approach. As part of the Eden Ideal, we look to Eden to give us kind of the solutions, aka the kingdom of God. I think the kingdom of God is the solution to a lot of man's problem. This is why that's what Jesus came proclaiming. So, one of the kind of tagline for what we're looking at is, in Eden, the man and woman were one. It says they were one and they were naked and unashamed. And we've been unpacking what that actually means. And it feels to be naked and unashamed. It does feel like, being willing to be vulnerable and being willing to be, but then critically being unashamed is when you know that the other person is not judging, is trusting, you feel safe with that other person. So we think that that's the solution, right? That's why our thing is about unified and reunifying kind of men and women and trying to help us build relationship again. So that's kind of what we're hoping to get our event to be about. Like, let's talk about how we can kind of help men and women get back together in unity and have those difficult conversations and be vulnerable in front of each other, so you can hear and have empathy and more understanding.
And that is key. Being non-judgmental is vitally important, especially when talking about these topics, and that's on both sides really. So looking at victims and looking at perpetrators as well. So when I'm doing work with perpetrators now, I really have to have that non-judgmental hat on, more so than when I worked with victims. So that's really important, so that both can be heard. Doesn't mean that you're condoning or you're justifying certain behaviors, but you still need to listen. And confidentiality as well is a really important one when it comes to trying to support or trying to have those discussions. Sometimes when someone comes forward and they share something, they don't want it to go all around the church and the neighborhood. So that's something as well that needs to be developed and worked on, how to keep certain information confidential, when to share it, when it needs to be shared appropriately. If that makes sense.
I don't know if this is something that you kind of do. I think it is from what you said you were doing in the past, but how do you deal with like the trauma of it? So assuming like someone's been abused and we've caught the perpetrator, we've dealt with the perpetrator, but like there's still a trauma there, and sometimes I think a lot of people kind of don't know what to do or how to respond to that or how to handle that. So like, would you have any advice for helping people to know how to support people through their trauma?
Okay, so you're talking about a victim that's made a disclosure, perhaps, and
Yeah, so I'm a
yeah,
church, I'm a church pastor, and
you're a pastor. Okay.
I've created a safe space. Someone has come and shared this thing. I've made sure that the men in my church don't understand, but there are still a lot of hurting people here. It's like, and I feel out of my depth. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a therapist. What do I do?
It's really important to connect with organizations in your community and people who have the expertise in the field to deal with helping victims and perpetrators as well. Because at the end of the day, people who are pastors, they're not experts in everything. Yes, they work with people and relationships, but there are some things that are just a bit out of their depth, which is fine. So what I would encourage is for churches to make those connections with those agencies and those charities, those professionals, so that they can call on them for help if necessary, but also they can signpost any victims who need that further support. And just for ministers and pastors to be honest with themselves and their limitations and their boundaries as well, because sometimes it's really hard to have a situation where you're working with the victim and the perpetrator. And there's a lot to be said about that anyway, and whether that's safe and the best thing to do. But yeah, signposting is key, and we shouldn't be afraid to use the professionals around us, whether they are people of faith or not. You don't have to be a Christian to give good advice about domestic abuse or how to recover from trauma. So we should use the people around us. And in that way, we could be, a really great example in our communities because we're working together, right? And people can then look at the church as a valuable place, where instead of looking at it as some archaic institution that, treats women badly and all sorts.
Yeah.
So I think we should reach out to professionals more and signpost.
On that note, Lorraine, please tell people how they can reach out to you. How can they find you? Because this is so important. I feel like the things you're talking about could bring so much healing to so many people that need it desperately. So I really hope, I don't know how impactful these conversations and what we're doing is going to be, but I really do hope that it does get out there so that people can get the right help. So if someone, can you first just be very clear, what do you offer and how can people find you to get that service?
Yeah, sure. So I offer training on the different areas of violence against women and girls. I offer these for churches and organizations who work with potential vulnerable people, vulnerable to abuse. You can get excellent, dynamic, thought-provoking, challenging sessions. It comes with an AQA award that you can have so you can show that you've gone through the project and you know about these issues. And if you want to hear more, you want to find out more, you could just visit my website, which is www.theneverproject.co.uk. You can email as well at info@theneverproject.co.uk. My number is also available. Do you want me to share that as well, Tolu?
If you're comfortable, it's only if you're comfortable.
I'll go for it. It's 0790 373 1835. So if you want to discuss anything, just give me a call and I'll be happy to have a chat.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. We'll make sure we put all of your information in the description as well, so we can get this. But this has been such a blessing talking to you, Lorraine. You've got so much. I can see your heart for this really important topic. So yeah, Joe, thank you, and I'm hoping that you're going to join us at our event as well.
I'd love to.
That's something for people to look forward to. Go cop a ticket so you can come and hear Lorraine talk on a panel live about some of these things. So yeah, really excited about that. Thank you so much once again, Lorraine.
Thank you, Tolu, for inviting me and for the work that you're doing with Eden Ideal.